thank you, Mark, for the invitation to be here again among a group of bright and eager young people ready to go out and change the world. That's the kind we need, because the world is not going to change by itself. But that it does change and that it can, history proves it to us. And there are these high points in history, which are then remembered for a very long time after they happen, and that can mark the life of a whole generation and numerous countries across the world. As a reference point, we've been given tonight the fall of Berlin in 1989. There were all sorts of events in Berlin celebrating and commemorating that event. And it was, I think, it stuck in the memory of so many people who saw it happening through the medium of television, who saw all these young people coming to chip away at what had been the physical embodiment, the symbol of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was Churchill's metaphor, but the Berlin Wall was very much a physical entity, a real barrier. Much like the Iron Curtain, the invisible one, it had the same infrastructures, if you like, than the borders of the then Czechoslovakia or the maritime borders of Latvia. These were borders that were meant to keep two world systems and two ideologies hermetically separate from each other. Every morning on the beaches of Latvia, a truck would pass with dragging a sort of rake, and they would rake the seashore sand so that if anybody should try and escape by boat, you could sort of see their footprints, and suppose they were, or suppose if spies, you see there was paranoia about spies coming in. If spies came in from abroad, then again you could see their footprints. They'd never heard about the folk tale which tells about the fox, that when a fox is pursued, either by a human or by another animal, it simply erases its traces with its tail. There are these ludicrous examples of protecting the borders, but they were not funny, really, to those people who did try, for instance, in Berlin, to get from one side to the other. And in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, the border was, there were guard towers, there were barbed wires, there were armed men watching. I remember coming from an international conference in Prague in '75 by train going west to Paris. And when we approached the border, the train was stopped. Everything was searched most thoroughly. Every person's papers were checked and triple checked. Our currency, which we were told we could exchange at the border, was taken away from us. When the train stopped in the station, there were these very high towers with the barbed wire and the armed men and guard dogs patrolling on the quays, and the men were there standing every sort of 10, 20 meters. It's difficult for you young people to imagine how serious the barrier was between these two parts of the world in a physical sense, how serious the consequences, in other words, being shot and killed for anybody who tried to escape the so-called workers' paradise. This separation, this physical separation, translated worldwide in world politics into a very much bipolar world. A world in which countries were aligned either for, to simplify it, for capitalism or for communism, or more correctly, for democracy and the communist ideology. The sort of understood, accepted version of that period in history is that we had a bipolar world. When the Berlin Wall came down, was an important step in a change of that bipolar world, but it really didn't happen for good until 2 years later, when in 1991, in August, the Putsch tried to seize and reinstall the communist power, or the power of the Communist Party, which fell through, and it's only in August 1991 that the Soviet Union collapsed, was liquidated. In December, the Russian Federation was created, and countries like the Baltic states had already announced their intention to regain their independence a year before, in 1990. And that was when Fukuyama called the end to history. Everybody said we have lived under a bipolar world, we lived under this conflict, under the threat of nuclear war and annihilation for millions of people, very tense moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis under President Kennedy, Khrushchev beating the table at the United Nations with his shoe, saying, you know, he is going to have his way, and besides that the West, they were going to sell the rope by which the West was going to hang itself. Well, it turned out it was the other way around. It was the Soviet Union that actually hung itself, and the West was victorious. At that moment, everybody said, wow, we've lost our bipolar world, now we have a unipolar world, and indeed in that unipolar world, the United States became the hegemon. They became more and more the single center of power around which, if you like, the broadest influence on world affairs could be noted. But I think that these are, in many ways, gross simplifications. There was no more a unipolar world in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union than there was a bipolar world before. At the very least, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had been the third world as well, and it's not for nothing that that term came into use. Nowadays, it's taken on a pejorative connotation. Many people object to it being used to refer to their country, for instance. But the fact is that between the powers aligned with the Soviet Union in a formal sense, I mean officially communist countries such as China, such as North Korea, as North Vietnam in its time, as Cuba is to this day, as Cabo Verde and others, there were countries that were not committed officially and openly, but who leaned more or less at different times or under different regimes that ruled them in one direction or another, and quite a number of them who tried to somehow tread softly between these two opposite poles and to, in their own mild little way, play the one against the other, certainly in terms of foreign aid, certainly in terms of votes in the United Nations. When some contested question came up in the United Nations, you would have the nations, the Western nations aligned and voting much the same as the United States, with some exceptions, mind you. We must remember that as well. Europe did not always vote the same way as the United States on every single thing. One must remember that. The West was never one united whole. But on the whole, voting coherently, and the communist countries on the other side voting coherently, and the ones in the middle, frankly, waffling in many cases, or more or less being seen as committed to one or the other part. Patrice Lumumba University was built and instituted in Moscow to bring in young leaders, somewhat like you here, to bring them in, give them an education, give them communist indoctrination, and then send them back to their countries to take over power and to install communist and follow the communist doctrine in their countries. And in many cases, this was quite successful, and communist or communist sympathizing regimes were indeed installed in many countries. At the same time, other countries that were doing business to a significant extent, say with the United States of America, would send their students to Western universities, and the traditions, or the Western traditions, would be perpetuated in them. I had an interesting experience when the United Nations called a conference against racism and xenophobia in Durban, South Africa, in the early 2000s. It was a conference where a big controversy arose about applying the term xenophobia to the attitude of Israel towards Palestine. This caused a big diplomatic kerfuffle. The result was that the Americans downgraded their delegation. Many European heads of state did not come, but nonetheless, there was a huge presence of non-governmental organizations, and it was an interesting summit, or rather a United Nations conference. And the interesting thing is, at some point, I was to participate in a panel on which sat also the President of Algeria, Mr. Bouteflika, Fidel Castro from Cuba, who was still at the time in tolerable good health, and also the President of Cabo Verde. And we sat down to a lunch together with other heads of state who were there before this our panel. And the interesting thing is, as they are having this conversation about, remember these programs we used to have for students, where they would meet in Moscow and exchange, establish contacts, then go back to their country and then continue these contacts, and how fruitful this was for our interaction and so on. And then the President of Cabo Verde turned to Bouteflika and said, now let me see, the terrorists for the Libération Nationale of Quebec, the ones that kidnapped some people in 1970 and actually killed one of them, these FLQ terrorists, how did it work? Did you take them first for their first phase of training and then they were sent to Cuba? Or did Cuba give them their first phase and then they went to Algeria and then I got them in the end, for, as it were, polishing them off, you see? So we had, here I was, you see, having spent much of my life in Quebec and having lived through the crisis, the October crisis in Canada, with armed men standing outside my window near the University of Montreal, I felt rather strange. And I realized that the conflicts that you get in any one country that you think are the fruit of local differences of opinion, of local aspirations, of local frustrations, in our modern world are frequently, if not fomented, then certainly supported, not just by other countries far away, but a number of them working in concert and in collaboration. And if anybody said about communist countries having subversive activities and having networks and so on, that this was Western propaganda and whatnot, I heard it from the horse's mouth, from these people who had been actually involved in these programs. In international decisions, as I said, one used to have really 3 blocks in the United Nations. When we say there was a unipolar world with the Americans dominating, I think what people meant by that in terms of actual economic power and military power, indeed, there was a long period when the United States were the hegemon worldwide, but very slowly that situation has been changing, and I fear that the latest midterm elections in the United States are a further step in the weakening of the worldwide influence that the United States can exert, for the simple reason that having a president of a different persuasion than the majority in the Congress is bound to be a barrier to passing legislation and to adopting also strong positions in foreign policy, although the American president has the privilege of having the Constitution allows him a fair amount of latitude in his foreign policy. We have seen similar situations in Ukraine, where after the Orange Revolution, which was greeted by a fantastic outpouring of civil society, of ordinary citizens going out in the freezing cold and staying there for weeks on end to contest an election that had been rigged, and insisting that the voice of the people actually be heard, to have then 5 years after the Orange Revolution of having the presidency of President Yushchenko in constant conflict with his former comrade in arms, Yulia Tymoshenko, as prime minister, and from various complicated internal politics reasons, in many ways paralyzing the legislative process, paralyzing the needed reforms such as pension reforms and other structural reforms that the country needed to go through, and that in many ways are responsible for the fact that in the last elections, President Yanukovych, against whom the population was ready to go out in the street and freeze to death to contest his election, where now, with honest elections and with a proper majority, they have put him in power and have given him a majority. It remains now to be seen how he's able to use that, considering that he's pushed back the pension reform, has not tackled it yet, has pushed it back by a year. It's a pity, because I think the population of Ukraine was waiting for it. The case of Ukraine is an example now of what's happening today here on the European continent. I sat for 2 years on a group that was called the Reflection Group on the Future of Europe. I was vice chairman of that. And one of the questions that, as we had, apart from our deliberations and contacts with experts, in our contacts with various groups who invited us to speak to them across Europe, one of the questions addressed to us by politicians and population alike was, what are the outer frontiers of the European Union? How far will it extend? How far is the European Union prepared to exert its influence? And where is the barrier to be drawn between the influence that the Russian Federation, as a direct heir of the former Soviet Union, rather clipped, with wings clipped in many ways, particularly with a number, a full ring of countries, which, like the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, regained the independence they had before the Second World War. But others, like Azerbaijan, like Kyrgyzstan, actually getting it for the first time, and establishing their new independence. Where is the line going to be drawn here in terms of political influence, in terms of orientation towards general philosophy of life, towards the stand on any number of questions? I think these, in respect to countries such as Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, the Central Asian and the Caucasus countries, that positioning is still not clear. So that when we say that we have a unipolar world just here and there on the Eurasian continent, how far does Europe extend? At some point, someone arbitrarily said it goes to the Urals, and I think that even President Putin has contested that and said Europe extends as far as Vladivostok, because Russia extends as far as Vladivostok. It's a debatable point. It is actually the Eurasian continent. And if you think about Europe, or about the European Union and its influence and its values and its system of governance, and the influence that it's ready to exert on its eastern neighborhood, where is going the line to be drawn in terms of soft power influence? We're not talking about military conquest. Hopefully, because Georgia did see that military conquest is not, alas, a thing of the past. There are still tanks crossing borders, which we had hoped never to see again. But on the whole, the chances of it and the risks of it are greatly diminished, if at least not completely eliminated. Influence, soft power, kind of system of values, a kind of system of governance that countries have. We have these truly gray zones on the Eurasian continent, and then going all the way from Russia, which you could qualify in any number of different ways, but certainly with a big question mark on it as to the kind of governance it has and its democratic commitment to an outright totalitarian system such as you have in North Korea and also in communist China, whether you have one-party system or one ideology, although in many ways loosening up. If you have a totalitarian system, you have control over everything. Then in China we have seen loosening over the economic policy of the country. away from the former Maoist absolute economic communism. Lately, there are signs of religious freedom, believe it or not, when in point of fact the communist ideology and Mao's little red book was the Bible. That was no joke. Mao's little red book was the Bible which you had to live. And there was no room for the Bible or any other sacred writings or any other conviction or belief. Now, I just read in the paper that on top of Mao, a mountain called in Mao's name, a Taoist nun has renewed a cloister, and it's going to be a tourist attraction, attracting money to an economically backward region of China. Very pragmatic, very innovative, very creative, and most definitely a departure from the Maoist strict communist doctrine. I think Chairman Mao must be turning over in his grave. Although on the other hand, maybe he understands that this is a very clever way of stimulating the economy of a region that the communist system has left behind in the economic evolution of that country. And yes, of course, when we talk about the multipolar world, of course, what we are seeing within a space of the last decade is that as the real vanguard economically, the European Union and the United States as the economic leaders, the big powers of the world, not only have been slowly losing ground to emerging countries from the former third world, the so-called BRICS, that among them, the largest among them, but of course the financial crisis which hit particularly the transatlantic alliance, the United States and the European Union countries, has dealt a very severe blow to the economic power that both the States and Europe had been having in the world. And this, I think, in the long run, is going to have an effect on world politics. We have seen it in many ways coming a long way off. In the last 5 years of Kofi Annan's mandate as Secretary General, he had asked me to be one of his ambassadors for reform of the United Nations. And what we discovered in that process is that under the Secretary General's impulsion, very serious studies were made of the UN system and how it is run. Very well-argumented, sound proposals for improvement. For instance, in the projects that at various times had been adopted by the General Assembly, for the first time the idea arose that follow-up should be done on them. And if a project was established and funds allotted to it, say in 1971, maybe in the year 2001 might be time to see whether it was still running and receiving budget allocations and how well it had done and whether it had been closed or not. And curiously enough, just as a simple thing such as the review of the projects, of which there turned out to be some 7,000 dormant projects of that nature that had never been evaluated. When the process of evaluation started, a huge wave of outcry came from many of the member nations, and I give you 3 guesses as to which ones they might be, and the first 3 don't count. Obviously, the countries that had benefited from these various projects that had been put in place at various times, that had had an acute necessity to them, accepted by the General Assembly, but that then had slowly faded away like old soldiers, you see, never to be heard from again, but that were pumping out the resources of the United Nations that were sorely needed in many other parts of the world, where either peacekeeping operations or post-conflict situations were direly needed, and where personnel, which is a costly process, needed to be dispatched quickly, and where the funds were not always available to do it. Certainly. The other aspect of the reform was in terms of the ability of the United Nations to react, both in crisis prevention, a new concept that did not exist at the beginning, but also in follow-up to crisis resolution. Just sending in the blue berets and somehow stopping the fighting is one thing, but actually getting to something resembling reconciliation afterwards is a completely different story. It takes a long time. You need to address the local authorities, the local populations. You have to engage their goodwill and their collaboration in getting a solution, not just putting a plaster over a wound, but actually getting it to heal, which is a completely different process. And curiously enough, precisely those countries that had been interested, should have been interested in this process, again for various reasons, decided to block these efforts. And it came to a point where we saw again a sort of lining up of the forces in sectors, so that if the European Union ambassadors came, worked together and said, oh, well, let's come with a common proposition so that we already have, you know, we can push this forward and have a proposal and have a vote on it. Next thing you knew, 70 countries lined up. And anything that the European Union proposed, they automatically voted no, they blocked it. And later the number rose up to 130. And I'm talking now about knee-jerk, reflex, no reactions, just because it was the European Union that was giving it. The European Union, which, by the way, apart from United Nations programs, is to this day the greatest donor of international aid on the whole planet, by a long shot. The European Union is way ahead of anybody else in terms of financial aid and other types of aid that it hands out to the rest of the world. And yet, it got this really, really organized, systematic, consequent, knee-jerk reaction of saying no proposals that came from them. And this is an interesting phenomenon. There's, I think, a psychological, there's a post-colonial element, of course, because a number of European powers had been colonial empires, and some of them for several centuries. So, of course, this has left long memories of oppression and colonialization, but most countries concerned had been decolonized for half a century at least, and others had never been colonized, ever. There are such countries where we're lucky to escape such a fate. And so we saw in this multipolar world strange phenomena happening, and they're continuing to this day. This seems to be almost in a natural order of things for people and countries to gang together in certain groups that feel a certain affinity. And this could happen for a variety of reasons. And which means, I fear, that a unipolar world in which, say, nations would gather at the United Nations and then, you know, all in harmony and on the grounds of rational argumentation, statistics, proof, etc., take enlightened votes, like the philosopher kings one would hope them to be, and the world would have something like science fiction writers talk about the planets having world governments and so on and so on. I think this is something that is going to remain in the realm of science fiction for some time yet to come. There are tendencies for, just happens within society with social groups. It happens with children in grade school, when you have one gang and another, even within the same classroom. You have a clique and another clique, and you belong to one or the other. It does seem to be part of human nature to have these sort of groupings. I think for a multipolar world, what seems to me the rational answer would be, is that the groupings would be based on rational argumentation. And that if there are, I don't know, people from Pacific Islands threatened with submersion within, say, the next 10 years in terms of climate change. And there are other nations who are using coal and all sorts of other fuels and contributing a high level of emissions because that happens to fuel their economy and their welfare. You could imagine how they have maybe conflicting interests. But then, ideally, one would have them come together in formal diplomacy, come together in international bodies, come together in a conference such as the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, and hopefully talk to each other, which I understand in Copenhagen, if they talked to each other, they didn't always listen to each other. So that here again, as the Maldive Islands, I am told, are slowly disappearing underwater, some of them already, meanwhile the rest of the world is somehow not quite, many parts of it are not quite ready to move, although as phenomena come and bring strong messages to us, such as, say, flooding in Pakistan, which shows that these large deltas, both on the Indian subcontinent, in other parts of Asia, on Africa, could suffer similar events in the future. I think the awareness then would rise, and we would move towards a world that is diverse in its multiplicity, that, if you like, is multipolar in terms of its economic clout, of its political influence, of its size, and any number of other criteria or dimensions on which you wish to rank them or regroup them. But I think ideally what we would like to see for the future of our planet is that we do not, or our nations do not see themselves wedded to belonging to a certain clique or to a certain group or to a certain position in advance on the basis of some sort of ideology or religion or anything else, but that they would be pragmatic, that they would be flexible, that they would be reasonable, open to empirical evidence, open to facts, figures, and observations, to objective input, if you like, even if in the end, of course, leaders of countries always have to take decisions that have an element of subjectivity, because we do not live in a mathematically straight and ordered world. It's a fuzzy world. We're operating with fuzzy sets and with fuzzy concepts, and one has to deal with them, certainly when one is in a position of governance. Decisions have to be taken every day. You do not have perfect total information. You make the best decision that you can. In this, what is the role of civil society, and what is the role of young people and future leaders like yourself? I think that the possibilities that the modern world offers to citizens of actually being heard, of intervening, or participating are unprecedented in our day and age. And I would say that by the time you reach my age, we will have had any number of technological leaps ahead which will have changed the way we communicate with each other, will have changed the way we transmit information among individuals, among groups, among officials, ministries, and businesses as well, by the way. The world is changing, and it's changing extremely rapidly. And the input of either individual persons, I mean, think of Nelson Mandela and his influence on South Africa. Think of Václav Havel and his influence of Czechoslovakia. My colleague on the reflection group, Lech Walesa, and Solidarność, and its influence on the fate of Poland and the whole communist system. Individuals can have an impact, and certainly groups can have an impact if they have passion, if they have commitment, and if they're ready to engage. The possibilities are really infinite. It's a matter of getting comrades in arms who do not fight with weapons, but with words and with ideas. There are any number of places in the world where people feel that the only way to get your arguments win over some others is to kill your opponent. Stalin is reputed to have had this phrase about possible opponents to the revolution, or counter-revolutionaries, as they used to be termed. And he told his entourage that, look, what's the problem? If you have a person and a problem, well, when you don't have a person, you don't have a problem. That was, of course, the whole basis of the mass executions, deportations, transfers of entire nationalities, being dumped in inhospitable steppes of Central Asia or of Siberia, where most of them were doomed to perish, and so on and so forth. That sort of argumentation still prevails in various forms in various parts of the world. I happen to sit on the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court. The court is a voluntary body to which states, parties to the Treaty of Rome belong. Others, such as the United States, do not belong to this day, but contribute, as a matter of fact, with their expertise and also with considerable funds, which I was surprised to find. The Trust Fund for Victims was established to compensate those who had suffered grievously from crimes against humanity, genocide, or war crimes in 3 countries at the moment in Africa, which have asked for help, and in which have handed out their citizens to be tried in The Hague before the Criminal Court. Any day now, we will probably hear the court rendering its first verdict for the first of these accused, but it is clear that whatever the verdict of the court and whenever it comes, there are enormous numbers of victims in northern Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Central African Republic, where atrocities are being committed. The latest, again, if you read the latest newspapers, apparently 600 women, again, being raped. This on the border between Angola and Congo. This happens all the time. The work that the International Criminal Court has allowed the Trust Fund for Victims to do is to try and engage with civil society and international bodies and groups on the ground, on the terrain, finding ways, finding partners to compensate victims in a variety of ways after they have been attacked. Now, when I say compensate victims, you must realize that the crimes committed against individuals in that part of the world are too horrendous to imagine. There are youngsters, 10, 9, 11 years old, being drafted into the jungle as mules for carrying equipment for guerrilla groups. They are forced to commit atrocities, given guns, and asked at the age of 10 or 11 or 12 to commit atrocities. And then they're being cut off from their communities, and they remain with a group, many of them, for the rest of their lives. Little girls are taken as sex slaves, and as are young women, into the jungle. People are being mutilated in the most horrendous of ways, having ears, noses, and lips cut off. Women are being raped or gang raped in such a brutal fashion that if they survive internal injuries, they suffer vaginal fistulas, which render them literally crippled. They walk around, literally their bodies rotting away and smelling to high heaven so that their own families reject them. And they need reconstructive surgery, which is being done in some areas by, say, concretely a group of surgeons, plastic surgeons from the Netherlands doing reconstructive surgery on victims of that sort. In some cases they are children, and people who have their lips and noses cut off have difficulties eating and difficulties breathing. Their survival is put under serious questioning. And so on it goes. The curious thing is about all of this, you see that we are looking at the consequences and trying to patch them up. And this is very much needed, and there are international bodies involved in it. Any number of them apart from the Trust Fund for Victims. The Trust Fund for Victims collaborates with scores, literally, of other bodies who have been on the ground as well. But I think there's another aspect of that sort of thing, and which is the prevention of conflicts. And this is something that happens particularly in parts of the world where governance in the modern, advanced, if you like, civilized sense has not really set deep roots, and where the security of citizens cannot be assured by the state. In other words, the state is not able to fulfill all the functions that it does, say, in the Federal Republic of Germany, or that it does in the United States of America, or in Iceland, or in South Africa, or in Australia. The inability of the state to fulfill its functions has severe consequences on the lives of the citizens. And then there's a need for something to fill that gap, and something to start operating. Very frequently, under such circumstances, conflicting interests, because they are not controlled by a state system, turn into armed conflicts and violence against populations. One way then, before sending in the Blue Berets or some other international body, or the European Union troops, as they do in various places as well in the world, is to have conflict prevention. And I had the privilege just a few days ago to be in Paris in connection with the awarding of 2 prizes by the Jacques Chirac Foundation, which awards 2 prizes each year for the last 2 years to people who have distinguished themselves in the prevention of conflicts. I'm a member of the jury, and I had the privilege of handing the prize of the jury to Latvia Brahimi, who has a long and distinguished, an Algerian by birth, a long and distinguished international career in both post-conflict resolution and building up of local governance, notoriously in the post-Taliban phase of Afghanistan, and then again in a later period in Iraq after the intervention of the coalition of the willing around the United States. But before that, for instance, in Lebanon, where he was able with his negotiations to contribute to finally signing agreements that put an end to 17 years of civil war in 1989. At that same date of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the 17-year-old civil war of Lebanon was finally put to an end, and Mr. Brahimi was instrumental with his diplomatic skills and his skills as a conciliator to contribute to that process. He spent many years as a special envoy under various official titles, under 3 different successive Secretary Generals. He started with Boutros Ghali, an Egyptian, went on to Kofi Annan, and still continues to this day under the current Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. You have here an example of international bodies using the skills and the resources and the experience. Mr. Brahimi had been involved, first of all, in his own country, Algeria, first of all gaining its independence from French rule. He had then worked within the Arab world as Vice President of the Arab League, had gained regional expertise, as I mentioned, among others, and then went on at the world level to work on these United Nations missions. This is somebody who worked under the, if you like, officialdom, under official structures, and collaborating with them, but contributing in an individual way. But there was another prize that was handed out by our jury, and that's one to a gentleman, an Italian gentleman called Mario Giro, who has been working for decades in complete obscurity, not in contact with any sort of international body, but a community, a religious community, a Catholic community called San Egidio, with its headquarters in Rome. And they have been involved for decades in conciliation, in negotiation, in peacemaking. And for instance, I mentioned northern Uganda as one of the areas where the International Criminal Court is intervening. Well, Mr. Giro, among many other places on our planet, had gone into the jungles of northern Uganda looking for Kony, the leader of the Lord's Liberation Army for 20 years or more, who had been rampaging and continues, alas, to rampage across that part of the country with various interruptions and hopes for signing an agreement with the government to put a stop to it. Mr. Giro had been working quietly, anonymously, in a shade, you might say, but in many cases managing, as he explained himself how he did it, with a respectful listening attitude, listening to both sides involved in a potential conflict, listening to the one and to the other, no matter how unreasonable the argumentation might be on one side or the other about what they were engaged in or what they threatened to engage in. And then, of course, acting as a bridge again, passing the message from one to the other and hoping that it will bring results. And the amazing thing is that it occasionally does. It does not do so always, and that is the sad part. But I think one should not be discouraged. I think that there is always hope of achieving something and preventing conflict, or of preventing the recurrence of conflict once if you like, the flames and the bloody part of it are over. I was put in such a situation last summer in August when the Club de Madrid, which is an organization, a voluntary organization of former heads of state and government from countries that have at some point or another made a transition to democracy, and sometimes after serious difficulties, or waiting for a long time for it, as in my country under Soviet rule, and who are willing to donate their time to do that sort of conciliation work in parts of the world where they're interested, talking to presidents, prime ministers, heads of parties, political leaders, parliamentarians, non-governmental organizations, you name it. And we do that, we go to different parts of the world where we have no vested interests. We do not represent either our government, for that matter, anybody else. We're completely neutral people with experience who offer our services to be somebody to listen, to try to understand, to be a sounding board for leaders of either non-governmental organizations, parliamentarians or presidents or whoever, for them to try out their ideas, to be a sounding board, share our experience. In no way have we power or in that, for that matter, neither soft nor hard nor in between. We simply have our own personality and our experience to offer. And curiously enough, in many cases, it seems to be helpful. This is what makes me hopeful for the possibility of intervening in the world in many other ways than where we normally expect it. We expect our governments to solve our problems. We expect the European Union to solve our problems. We expect the United Nations to solve our problems. And they do their best, believe me, they try. They do try, and they keep trying and going back to the drawing board. But there are so many cracks left in between. There's such a vast field of necessities and needs and lacks out there in the world. And with our modern technologies of communication, the ability to find kindred spirits, sympathetic souls to whatever effort you want to do. Jean Monnet, when he started with Robert Schuman this idea of what became eventually the European Union, said that he would have la politique des petits pas, the policy of small, step-by-step progress. And you see, and of course the Chinese Confucian wisdom picked up by Mao again is that the longest journey starts with a single step. This is true. This is all too true. And it means that that small step to start the journey can be taken by anyone. It doesn't have to be the Secretary General of the United Nations or the President of the European Council or the President of your country or anything else. It can be you. You can do a step in the right direction to change the world for the better. I think that is the message that I would like to leave to you. It is not just a multipolar world that we now have, but it's a multitudinous world which really needs every kind of commitment, of talent, of goodwill, and humanity. The world needs it very sorely, because there are people who sometimes wonder, are they the same species as us, or do they come from another planet? But there they are with us, and we have to live with them. So all I can say is, ladies and gentlemen, bon courage, and keep at it.
Yeah, there is. Just waiting for the microphone. Firstly, thank you very much, Dr. Freiberga. We do now have an opportunity for questions from the audience, and if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very inspirational and certainly thought-provoking speech. And thank you for mentioning the gender issue, in particular women in Congo, in the DRC. My question is regarding the use of rape as a systematic form of violence and what can be done in order to prevent it. If you can comment on that. Thank you.
It is a very disquieting fact that mass rapes accompany armed violence. That much is clear. Rape as a form of aggression does seem to be linked to the levels of testosterone, in other words, a hormonal level in men, so that there's a biological basis for it, alas. It's a leftover from our evolution. And it seems to be that there seems to be a social component to it, because the concentration, you could actually draw on the map the density of rapes happening, say, on the continent of Africa. And number one, yes, it will be clustering around areas of armed conflict, like Darfur and Sudan and that region, and then Central Africa is another center. And therefore, my impression as a psychologist is that there are culturally induced patterns of behavior, a vicious circle of aggression, particularly targeting women. And in many parts of that continent, the conflicts, the armed conflicts that happen typically between men, involve sexual aggression against women and children, by the way, as an inherent component of that conflict. And that is a very distressing situation. And that can only be remedied by the way children are brought up and by the way values are perpetuated in local society. This is why so many organizations working in that part of the world are trying to various programs. I have seen a number of them. In fact, the Trust Fund for Victims supports some of them, which have teaching programs for young children to teach them respect for the other, for another human being, tolerance for differences, say, of opinion, skills, social skills of how to interact. Very elementary things that seem to be lacking in the upbringing of vast segments of those populations, and where the local people themselves say, we are suffering terribly from this and we would like to put an end to it, so that they are willing collaborators and are willing to try different methods of how to break that vicious circle of violence that gets transmitted from one generation to the next.
Hi, thank you. My name's Craig. I'm a student of law and politics in the UK, and I just graduated from Victoria College at University of Toronto. Yes. My question, I was wondering if you could expand some more. Thank you for introducing the concept of the multipolar world in specific, the third world sort of as, or the developing world, as one of these poles that has sort of an autonomous base of power. And in relation to peace building, I'm wondering if you could comment on how that process might actually be complicated by the fact that this power is not unipolar, that there's not a unilateral power that can dictate where peace building efforts are necessary or how to proceed. And by adding in this variety of voices, including the voices of countries where peace building has often been necessary, does that make the process easier in that there's more actors who are able to speak up and lead it, or does it make it more complicated in that there's more conflicting opinions perhaps about how to proceed?
The conflicting opinions, of course, come most directly from those who have vested interests in the conflict. Conflicts do not happen out of the blue, and in spite of the hormonal component, there's always also a gain involved. Frequently, alas, natural resources that a country possesses become, in fact, a curse on it. Be it diamonds or other resources or oil that are discovered, or gas. And when there are then conflicts about who is going to gain control of that resource, who is going to distribute the profits. So that, in an outgoing sort of circle from the center of the conflict to those who indirectly benefit from one outcome or another, clearly there's going to be support. And this is why we have frozen conflicts. This is why we have conflicts that for decades do not budge, because there are opposing forces that benefit from one aspect or another, or who refuse to find a solution. The multiplicity of voices, as living in democratic societies, we take it for granted that pluralism is a good thing, but you know very well that it can lead to cacophony, it can lead to confusion, it can lead to paralysis. If everybody pulls the blanket in a different direction, you can tear the blanket to shreds, and everybody has a little shred of it, but nobody's kept warm. So that too much diversity can have a negative as well as a positive aspect.
President Freiberga? Does this work? Okay. Okay. President Freiberga, allow me to take this opportunity to express to you our tremendous gratitude for really some really insightful and enlightening reflections. Refreshing as always. I think we've all benefited greatly from your address. Thank you very, very much to President Freiberga. Thank you.